Hey, this is David from the Piecing It Together podcast, a podcast about movies and the movies that inspire them. For over 4 years each week, a guest and I take a look at a new movie through the lens of what other movies we think were either an influence or connect in some other way. It's a fun, unique way to discuss films that leads to a great list of other movies to check out that either explore the same themes and ideas or maybe utilize similar filmmaking techniques. Including special episodes in our side series that twist the format, we've done over 200 episodes, so there's bound to be one on a film you've been thinking about and want to dig deeper into. So check us out on all the major podcasting apps and at piecingpod.com.
Hey, it's Dan. Before we begin, I want to tell you about another podcast from Movie Maker. It's called Movie Maker Interviews, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Great interviews with people who make movies. Guests range from people like Charlie Kaufman and Werner Herzog to the newest up-and-coming indie filmmakers. If you love movies, you'll love this podcast, Movie Maker Interviews. Get it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you got this podcast from. In the early 1970s, over 20 years into the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, conditions between the two superpowers began to thaw out a bit. It was the policy known as détente. And throughout the 1970s, both countries put their differences aside and attempted to play nice with each other. In 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon became the first president to ever visit Moscow. Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev would return the favor the following year. The first of the SALT treaties, drafted to limit the growing number of nuclear weapons, was signed in 1975. And perhaps most amazing of all was the joint space adventure known as the Apollo-Soyuz mission. It was the final mission in the Apollo space program. The world watched as American astronauts took off from Cape Canaveral, Florida, to meet up with Soviet cosmonauts high above the heavens.
Literally thousands of riveted. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We should have ignition very soon. We have it. And I believe we have a commit, and we're moving. Lift off. Clear of the tower. Clear of the tower. It's on our way.
Soviet cosmonauts welcomed the U.S. astronauts, and the two had a symbolic handshake to signify that the countries were letting bygones be bygones. They were going to agree to disagree. It was a perfect showing of what détente was supposed to be.
Speaking in Minneapolis this afternoon, Secretary of State Kissinger praised the joint space mission as a symbol of progress in American-Soviet relations.
We will speak up for our beliefs with vigor and without self-deception. We consider détente a means to regulate a competitive relationship.
In 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz mission was big news. There was massive coverage of the spaceflight, the spacecraft docking, and the symbolic handshake. Everything went pretty much according to plan. And somewhere in that historic event is a glossed over fact. While in space, the astronauts received a communication from actress Elizabeth Taylor. Liz was already a Hollywood legend by 1975, but still, her communicating with astronauts in space was not a normal thing. Producer Paul Maslansky was in the room with Liz when she communicated with them.
I was called into the office of the head of the studio, and Arshansky and myself and Elizabeth Taylor sitting at the big boardroom, and we had a communication with the Soyuz Apollo mission. And we were able to speak to the cosmonauts and the astronauts. When I say we, Elizabeth did, because that was the whole thing, you know. It was a big number for Elizabeth to speak to the cosmonauts and the astronauts on that Apollo mission. And that was dramatic and wonderful. We all felt that we were part of something that was quite unique.
But there was a very specific reason that Elizabeth Taylor was allowed to speak with the Apollo-Soyuz mission. While the men in space were practicing the spirit of détente on the grandest stage achievable, Elizabeth Taylor was doing her own version of détente here on Earth. She was starring in the first U.S.-Soviet film production, a whimsical children's movie that would appeal to everyone. In it, Taylor would, for the first and only time, play 4 roles: A movie that would feature American stars in front of the camera and have Soviet technicians applying their craft behind the scenes. The intention was noble, a cinematic act of détente featuring the best of what both countries could do. But what both sides of this artistic endeavor did not realize was just how different the worlds they came from really were. And the task of making 2 hours of cinematic entertainment would be far more difficult than a space docking and a handshake. My name is Dan Delgado, and in this episode, we're exploring this now seemingly forgotten movie that attempted to bring two countries together. Welcome to the industry. Clara Reese had little to do with the industry. She was born in Romania and moved to the United States when she was a teenager, and she spoke several languages. By 1969, she was a middle-aged business executive living in Cleveland, Ohio. One of her main tasks was to negotiate business deals between the companies she worked for, Tower International Corp., and the Soviet Union. She was a frequent traveler to the Soviet Union, and by the late 60s, she had observed a number of social and political changes going on within the country. She thought this was exciting, and in 1969, she had an idea to bring the United States and the Soviet Union together. Her first brush with the industry was with a movie called The Fixer. It was shot in Hungary, and Clara was hired as a go-between for the Hollywood production and the then communist Hungarian government. It's during this production that Clara meets producer Edward Lewis. Lewis was mainly serving as a producer for movies directed by John Frankenheimer. Frankenheimer, for example, directed The Fixer, and Clara and Edward Lewis hit it off and both thought that a United States-Soviet Union co-produced picture would be a grand idea. And, to make it even better, it just so happened that Edward Lewis owned the rights to what they thought would be the perfect movie to make. The Blue Bird. The Blue Bird was originally a play written by Belgian playwright Maurice Maeterlinck and first premiered in Moscow in 1908. It's a Wizard of Oz-esque fantasy about two children, a brother and sister, looking for the Blue Bird of happiness. Along the way, they encounter fairies and witches and Father Time and household items that have come to life like bread and milk. Seriously, The Blue Bird had already been adapted as a movie several times, as a silent film in 1918 and in 1940 as a vehicle for Shirley Temple. In the Soviet Union, an animated version of The Blue Bird was released in 1970. The thought was that audiences in both the United States and the Soviet Union would be familiar with the source material. And as an apolitical story with a simple message done as a musical that could appeal to the whole family, it would be seemingly a near-ideal choice. Getting the ball rolling on The Blue Bird would take a couple of years. It's only after the policy of détente started in 1971 did things start to slowly take shape. But eventually, a deal was struck between producer Edward Lewis and 20th Century Fox on the U.S. side and Lenfilm on the Soviet side. Fox would provide big Hollywood stars, Lenfilm would provide the locations, the accommodations, and the crew. But the director would be an American, George Cukor. And on paper, Cukor is a great choice for something like The Blue Bird. He had experience directing musicals, winning an Oscar for My Fair Lady. He had worked with every major Hollywood starlet and was greatly respected throughout the industry. He even spent a couple of weeks working on a children's musical fantasy once before. It's called The Wizard of Oz. He helped create the look of those iconic characters. But the one thing that should be considered here when it comes to George Cukor is that he was 75 years old during the filming of The Blue Bird. He did help line up an impressive cast. Elizabeth Taylor would take on 4 roles, and Ava Gardner, Cicely Tyson, Will Greer, James Coco, and Jane Fonda would also sign on. On the Soviet side were actors Margarita Terekova, Oleg Popov, along with ballet dancers from the Kirov Ballet Company. And playing the lead children, the real main characters of were 6-year-old British actress Patsy Kensit and 9-year-old American actor Todd Lookinland, though both would have a birthday during the production. But don't let their ages fool you. Patsy and Todd were both experienced child actors at this point.
I had just come off of doing a series that was called, it was an ABC series called The New Land. And that's what I was doing just right before it got cast on the Bluebird. Prior to that, I've been doing TV episodes and commercials, and I knew what was going on. I knew what it was like to be on a film set and to be part of a production, for sure. I wasn't brand new by any means.
That's Todd Lookinland. And for Todd, getting cast in the Bluebird was a relatively normal experience, except for one thing.
That whole process was pretty normal up until the point where I got cast. They said, okay, you got the job. Of course, it was a big deal. And then as they started hashing out the details, my mom, who had been a stage mom for many years up to this point, was curious to know who the welfare worker was going to be that the production took. And welfare worker was another name for the stage teacher. And the stage teacher is also the person who is in charge of making sure that the production follows the child labor laws, right? They surprisingly have a lot of power on the set. Production said, "Oh, we're not taking we're filming this in Russia. We don't have to follow those rules, essentially, right? We're not going to be in California, so we're not bringing a teacher, welfare worker, blah blah blah." So my mom said, "Well, we're not going then, because I can't pull my kid out of school for an entire year, right?" And they said, "Okay, fine, we'll find somebody else." So then they started the casting process all over again, and they came back, and Cukor wanted me to do the job. And so they said, okay, we'll bring a welfare worker.
And for Todd, he was made aware that this was not just another picture or TV show that he was working on. It was meant to be something special.
I mean, you got to remember, I was 9 when I got cast, right? So this sort of like conceptual détente between the Cold War powers was something that wasn't in my brain. All that was explained to me, and 20th, they made a big deal out of this. And I don't know how deep this goes into what sort of State Department influence was involved in this, but they made a big deal. They made a big deal in the press and letting everybody know that this was this big cultural exchange that was going to happen between the two countries. So that was all explained to me. It was definitely talked about. And when we got to Russia, it was definitely a big deal. The Russians really made a big deal about, they were really, really into the showmanship of, making sure there's a delegation here, that they have both the hammer and sickle flag and the stars and stripes, and, that there's important people. They were always making a big deal out of the fact that there's these two countries together.
Once the cast and crew were assembled in Leningrad, it was clear this was not going to be a typical Hollywood production experience. For one, they were starting in January, right when winter is in full swing.
We got to Leningrad in January, and it was dark and cold. Now, I'm a kid. I've lived in Southern California my whole life, and all of a sudden we're in this very bizarre place that doesn't seem like it's caught up to modern time, and everything looks like behind, and it's dark for most of the day. It's like the sun, kind of pokes up for like 4 hours a day, then disappears, and it's cold. I mean, it was really shocking. It was not a very modern city at the time, for sure.
And I should point out for those of you who might not know this, but Leningrad is now known as St. Petersburg. The shooting plan for the Bluebird was 100 days to be spread out over less than 5 months. The budget was originally set at $2.4 million, half of which came from the Soviet side. But problems started pretty quickly. Communication became a major issue between the Soviets and the Americans. Interpreters were needed for everything, and it bogged down the production. As many as 20 interpreters were on set at the same time. Another problem was the outdated equipment being used. While producer Edward Lewis had promised George Cukor he would have the best equipment for his crew to use, What ended up being there was outdated equipment from the Soviet side.
That whole transforms over to the making of the movie too. Technically, they were. I don't know what era you could say they were in. Like the 20s. I mean, their equipment was just production just didn't happen because they didn't have the modern filmmaking tools to make a movie. Oh, it was a disaster. They couldn't even they were they'd get the film for dailies and the production was looking at the dailies going, what is this? This looks terrible. So they started sending the film to London to be processed, and then they'd send it back. So dailies were always 2 days behind. Think about how that screws up a production schedule. When you can't look at the film you shot for 2 days, right? It's just a little thing, but it's indicative of the fact that their film stock, their cameras, their processing technology, it was just, it was really antiquated.
Not only was the equipment out of date, but some members of the crew were not entirely up to the task. Some of the sets that were being built ended up being built a little too literally.
The movie starts out in this sort of cottage, right? This is the first setup where we started filming. And the Russian art department built this thing like a cottage on this soundstage. The walls didn't come apart, right? They built the second floor, they built it with a second floor. You always build a stage, the stairs go up to nowhere, right? And then, because you don't want to carry the camera and everything up and down and all the stuff. It's just totally impractical. You make the walls so you can pull them out so the camera can get here or there or whatever. They didn't even conceptually understand that. It was like they built a stage for a play or something. It was just all totally stationary. So Cukor comes in. He's like, "What the hell what is this? How do we work with this?" So it was there was a lot of head scratching, I think, at the beginning.
One notable example of this was Jonas Gricius, a well-regarded cinematographer in the Soviet Union who was assigned to the Blue Bird. But it was eventually realized that Gricius was lacking the proper experience for this picture. He had never filmed in color before. Additionally, he had never filmed a person of color prior to this and could not light actress Cicely Tyson properly. Food also became a major issue. Elizabeth Taylor became ill and would continue to work despite having a full-on flush red face. Again, the inexperience of Jonas Gricius shooting with color was evident as he couldn't light her red face properly. Eventually, Taylor would head off to London and be diagnosed with dysentery. James Cukor was hospitalized and needed a gallbladder operation. His role as the family dog come to life had to be recast. British actor George Cukor would replace him. The Western cast was all holed up at the same hotel, the Hotel Leningrad, and most of them ate at the same hotel restaurant.
We're not going to survive eating at this restaurant. There just, there just wasn't hardly anything there. And so we started figuring out what was nearby where we could go and buy our own food, right? Mm-hmm. Over the bridge and down the street, there was a bread store, and there was no grocery store, right? You had to go into these different stores. So you go in one store and get oranges, and you go in another store and get some bread. And so we started figuring out, where to go get our own stuff. And we had this suite in the hotel where we kind of set up this makeshift, well, my mom did, set up this sort of makeshift deal. And we would try to have our own sort of milk and cereal and yogurt and stuff like that. And then not too long after that, production started doing this thing where we would literally put in a grocery store order. And I'm not sure how often they did this. It was once every 2 weeks or something. And they would bring stuff in from London. They would send somebody over to buy, Cheerios or whatever for you to have.
By March, things weren't improving, and by now, the word was getting out. The American press was reporting all of the problems on the set. Jane Fonda told Newsweek that the Soviet crew would work only until the end of the designated workday. It doesn't matter what scene you're in the middle of, at 5:30, the plug gets pulled. News of the bad Soviet food Outdated equipment, communication troubles, a rising budget, and every other detail was getting out to every Hollywood gossip columnist. Before James Cukor became ill and left, he was asked by a reporter how long he'd been in the Soviet Union. "Oh, about 5 years," he replied, and then added that he would never do another film there. Things weren't looking good, and they seemed to be only getting worse. And then the production shut down.
I don't really know all the inside business details of what happened, but production collapsed. I mean, it just fell apart. And right about that time, Liz got really sick as well. Here's the other thing, man. Liz got sick with dysentery, right? From drinking water, right? We were like boiling our water to have drinking water, right? And this is in their like fanciest hotel in Leningrad, right? So Liz got really, really sick, and she went to London, and the production just fell apart. And I remember that there was a sense of, we got to get out of here. There was a sort of like exodus. And we got on a train to Helsinki, and then a plane from Helsinki to whatever the hours we went back to California. And during that time, there was a sense of, if we stay here, there's nothing, the production's gone, right? There's nobody here to look after us, because I mean, that's what part of the producer's job when you're on location is, to look after every cast and crew, right? And it just fell apart. They were gone. So I remember this feeling of, we got to get out of here. And it was sort of like, let's go, pack up, let's go. And I'm not really sure why they decided to reboot the whole thing, why 20th Century Fox didn't just pull the plug then, but they wanted to complete this project.
20th Century Fox needed to retool things. Originally, The Bluebird was scheduled for a Christmas 1975 release, and that was not going to be possible at the pace the production was going. Plus, Ava Gardner had quit the picture altogether and had gone to her home in London. Changes needed to be made, and they were. Alan Ladd Jr., the head of 20th Century Fox, made a number of changes. Edward Lewis, the producer who helped originate the project with Clara Reese, was moved off the production. He'd get an executive producer credit when it was all said and done. And Ladd brought in a new man to right the ship. Producer Paul Maslansky took over the production duties.
I just got on a plane and went off to Leningrad.
That is Paul Maslansky.
Laddie said, "Look, we're making the very first co-production between the Soviets and East-West co-production. We have a terrific producer of it who put it together, Eddie Lewis, who was John Frankenheimer's producer for many of Frankenheimer's pictures. In any event, Eddie Lewis was doing the picture, and he had a group over there in Leningrad. And after about, I think it was 4 or 6 weeks of production, things had bogged down considerably, apparently. The Soviets were very unhappy with the production side of the Western side, the American side of production. And Jimmy Cukor had gotten ill and left the picture, and Ava Gardner went back to London, and Elizabeth was unhappy, apparently, and she went back to London. And the whole thing was collapsing.
And Paul had a reputation for straightening out troubled productions and had filmed in the Soviet Union before.
And Laddie called me and one weekend said, "Look, the Russians know you," because I had been involved in another film in the 60s called The Red Tent.
The Red Tent from 1969 was an Italian-Soviet co-production. It was the first time the Soviets had a co-production with anyone from the West, and it filmed in Estonia. So Paul gets right to work, and the first thing he does is change the cinematographer.
I decided very early in the game, after seeing some of the material, that the photography was not really up to the standard. They had a Soviet cameraman on the picture, a very distinguished one. But since there were so many English and American stars on the picture, and the Soviet cameraman didn't speak any English, that was a bit difficult also for George Cukor, to relate to the cameraman. I discovered that George Cukor allowed the cameraman to do quite a few of the setups while George concentrated on the performances of the artists.
And Paul doesn't just bring in any cinematographer. He gets Freddie Young, the acclaimed British cinematographer who had over 100 credits to his name by 1975. Even better, when Young arrived in Leningrad, he brought his own camera equipment. He had worked on Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, a movie that pretended to be shot in Russia, though it was shot in Spain, and on Bowani Junction, a picture directed by George Cukor and starring Ava Gardner. And speaking of Ava Gardner, there was the matter of getting her back on set. She had agreed to do the Bluebird almost as a favor to George Cukor. There wouldn't be a big payday, but he did promise her some luxury accommodations, and she would only have to shoot for 3 weeks. Well, none of that turned out to be accurate, and getting her back on set was no minor task.
First of all, Ava left the picture and was in London when I went over to start the picture again. She quit the picture, literally went back to London. Jimmy Coco left the picture, he went back to the States. We had to replace him. But Ava was important to this picture because she had already been on film for a bit, as had Coco, but not as much as Ava. So I had to go back to London and convince Ava to come back to Russia. And it was really a tough shot. It really was tough to get her back. She just hated it. She just didn't like it at all. She felt very uncomfortable. And when she went back, she did her work. Always had this wonderful flask on the, and it was mineral water, but it wasn't. Anyway, Ava was terrific. She ultimately was really terrific. She had the wryest sense of humor. She really did. She was, as a jazz musician, you always think of people being hip or not hip, or being aware and not aware. Ava was really aware. Wow. Ava was able to suss out someone who's bullshitting her in 5 seconds and had a voice that could let you know about it,
Paul made the rounds with the entire cast, getting everyone back on board and back on set, making sure that the Bluebird could be finished.
The very first day I got there, I decided what I had to do was introduce myself to the cast. So I knocked on the doors and knocked on Elizabeth's door. She heard about the producer being replaced and all the production manager being replaced. And I introduced myself, and she invited me in. And by the end of that evening, with a bit to drink and some caviar and blinis and things like that I had sent up from the restaurant, we were friends. We became friends. And I said to Elizabeth, Elizabeth, the word is from George Cukor that you are late to set every day. And I knew that this is what is kind of traditional with Elizabeth. It was for many of her pictures. I had heard this, that she doesn't show up for her call regularly, and you have to compensate for it and give her an early call, a late call, and futz around with it, etc. So anyway, I said, Elizabeth, George has said it's very frustrating for him, very frustrating sometimes that you don't meet your call. She looked at me and gave me a hug and says, don't you worry about it. Don't you worry about it. This is a new world. We're going to do things differently, et cetera, et cetera. We pledge fidelity, et cetera. We were on the piss. We had been drinking all night.
The next day rolls around, and what do you think happens?
On Monday, she had a call at 7 o'clock. And, of course, the on set was 9 o'clock. And George was on set at 9, and at 7 o'clock, I was at the studio at 7, and she hadn't shown up. 7:30, no show. 8 o'clock, no show. So I know we're in shit because makeup and hair with the role that she had was quite elaborate. And I knew we were going to be in a bit of an issue here. So comes time for her to be on set, and she's not there. And Cukor said, if she's not here on set in 30 minutes, I'm going back to the hotel, which would have fucked us for the day, you know. I knew. And the last thing I wanted on my very first day as sort of trying to run the show, for that to happen would be a catastrophe. I called the hotel, and they got her out to makeup and hair, and finally down, and it's about 10 minutes before the deadline, and George and she's still not on set, and George is getting restless. Everyone's restless. First, I sent the assistant director down, and he comes up and said, they won't let me in the dressing room. And I sent the production manager down, and he said, no, they're not being nice down.
Now, Paul, who is fairly unhappy himself at this point, has to go and check on Liz. And just a little bit of a warning, the audio here is not great.
So I go down and I pound on the door, and the door opens a crack, and it was one of Elizabeth's people. She had 4 or 5 people with all nice people, but, you know, all beckoning to Elizabeth's call. And I said, let me in. And I go in and there she's sitting and she's almost ready. She has her makeup on, it appears, and the hair has been done, and just some adjustments being done to her costume. And she looks at me through the mirror. And as I walk in the door, and she gives me this harsh glance, so different than the night before. And she gets up, and in a very dramatic gesture, she approaches me, and the room turns to ice, you know. Who knows what's going to happen now? She comes up to me, and she takes my head in both hands and turns my head and blows in my ear, right? And just, you know, I melt. This is Elizabeth Taylor with those eyes. It was extraordinary. Yeah, and blows in my ear. And she said, you sweet thing, I'll be there in just a moment.
So in case you missed it, Liz blows in Paul's ear and says, you sweet thing, I'll be there in a minute. And it was the last time she was late to set. After that, it was a matter of taking care of the things that really mattered.
I guess the biggest problem with the men's, with the toilets, they were just dreadful. I mean, they've changed, thank God, because I've been over there since. But they were just beneath contempt. They were awful. They were just dreadful. And then, you know, when we went, no toilet paper. I had to bring toilet paper from Finland on a weekly. It seemed to me it was almost on a monthly basis. It was, or a weekly basis. I would ship over toilet paper.
And of course, there was the food.
Well, food was a big issue. On set, we didn't have what we normally have in the States and in England, the normal craft service, you know, where you have a table with all sorts of things that people go and snack. So that was a problem because the artists always expected something like that. That was a minor issue. And I solved that by going to the American consulate and introducing myself there and befriending one of the people that ran the commissary there. And I managed to get some wonderful things for the unit, you know, to always have which the Russians also really appreciated greatly.
And over the next few months, Paul found himself traveling quite a bit to get things for the production.
And the other thing was that the living allowance was that had been arranged for the artists was not enough for them to travel over to Finland, for example, on a weekend to get some good food, because that was the thing in those days. Was a short hop over into Helsinki. You flew over into Helsinki, and that's where everything Western was available.
And with Paul Maslansky running things, the Bluebird started to get better.
And he turned that thing around and made it a lot more easy to just, day to day be there.
So were you enjoying yourself at that point?
Yeah. It became fun actually at that second half. There was a separate studio that we went out to, and I can't remember the name of it. It was sort of outside the city, and we ended up shooting a lot out there as well. And it was fun because we were outside all the time, and there was like a lake there that you go swimming in, and there was like old destroyed Soviet tanks that were out there that I guess maybe they used in a movie or something. I mean, it was just like a lot more loose and fun, and we were able to run around, and it was a little more fun to be a kid.
And to help give you an idea of just how difficult and how slowly the production was moving for the Bluebird, this is former child actor Stephen Warner. He tried out for the lead in the Bluebird.
And it was decided that I was too small.
And like Todd Lookinland and Patsy Kensit, Stephen had a lot of experience by age 9. He had been the lead in 1974's The Little Prince. So the producers wanted him in the picture somewhere. He wound up with a small role in a big scene. And even though it's a small part, Stephen is made aware that this is intended to be an important film.
My agent said to me, you have to remember I was a little kid, and being a little kid, it wasn't really, I didn't really look at it in the same way as I would do now. And he said to me, you have to do things that are important, and this film is actually a very important film. So we want you to do this. And I said, okay. And I think all I was really concerned about was, do I have to go to the dentist again? Are they going to give me lots more injections again? And the answer for that was no. But you should have a lot more fun with this one because there's lots of children in this film. So it was kind of sold to me like that. And the next thing I know, there we are at Heathrow Airport, getting on a plane, and off we went to Russia.
Off to the Soviet Union to shoot his one scene that is full of children. And things, as you already know, do not run smoothly.
For the scene that I was in, The Land of the Future, that took 3 weeks to do that.
It took 3 weeks just for that one scene?
Yeah, that took 3 weeks.
So that's one scene, 3 weeks. Now, to be fair, though, not all of the 3 weeks was spent on set. Stephen did have to do a recording session and table reads first. And he had to meet the leads, Todd and Patsy.
I remember it very, very clearly because the first time I ever met them both, my mum was my chaperone, and she told me, she said, you're going to meet an English girl called Patsy, and an American boy called Todd. They've been there already for a long time, and you'll probably get to meet them, the day that we arrive, or maybe the next day. I said, okay. And I remember us all arriving with all of our luggage in the hotel lobby, and there was a big staircase, and I remember Patsy and Todd flying down the stairs and literally hugging all of us because, and they were introducing themselves, and they were so excited because there were other Western kids for them to talk to.
And this is probably not a surprise that 9-year-old Stephen has no sense of what things were like in the Soviet Union.
Not really. I didn't really understand what they meant about the Iron Curtain. I didn't really understand what they meant. I mean, to me, Russia was just another country where they spoke a language that I really didn't understand. So I didn't really understand the significance of it. Not really until I was there. And I realized then how different Russia really was, and how they didn't really seem to have much, that they couldn't get the things that we could get, which I found very strange. I didn't understand it.
But it quickly becomes clear once he gets there.
On the flight on the way out, one of my suitcases went missing. It ended up going to Japan. And so some of my clothes I didn't have. And so the production company gave my mum some money to take me out to buy me some clothes. And she was horrified because she goes, I can't make him wear these things. They're awful. I didn't have any underwear. And Patsy's mum said, oh, it's okay. He's only a little boy. He can wear Patsy's pants. It doesn't matter, you know. And I was like now I think about it, I think it's quite funny.
Yes.
And at the time I didn't think about it at all. I was just like, okay, yeah, whatever. But yeah, I remember my mum like buying underwear for me in Leningrad and then saying, you can't wear these. This is awful. You know, I'm not going to put my kid in this.
And other than whatever was going on with Russian underwear, there were the typical food issues.
I mean, for example, I know that Patsy's mum, Marge, she used to fly backwards and forwards between the UK and Russia, and she used to bring back a suitcase full of denim and deodorant and soap, and basically give it to all of the dressers and the maids in the hotel and anyone like that, just to, you know, give them something, because they couldn't get things like that there.
But the thing that really stood out when I spoke with Stephen was his assessment of the slow filming process.
Well, for me, it was a film set as a film set, you know, and I see it as just that. It's a place where I have to work and do all those things that I'm taught to do and say the words I'm taught to do. But the thing about this particular project that really blew my mind was how many people there were on the set, because there was the scene that I'm in, there are literally hundreds of children in that scene. And that for me was something I wasn't used to. I was only ever used to working in scenes where there was only a few people, and all of a sudden to be in this massive group of people, that was unusual. And also as well, everybody was speaking Russian and I didn't understand what they were saying. So there was translators everywhere, and the only people that I could really understand were the kids that I flew out with. So we all became very, very close very, very quickly, purely because of the language thing. It was very difficult because every time anything was said to anyone, it had to be repeated, I don't know how many times, in both English and Russian. But this was incredibly labor intensive, and it was a lot of, you know, discussions between the American production side of the team and the Russian production side of the team about how this is going to be done, how it's going to be, you know, and it was just so much hanging around. It was just unbelievable. If we ever, you know, did one take in a day, it was quite amazing. I mean, I felt really sorry for Patsy because she was out in Russia for the best part of a year.
It's likely out of everyone there, it's maybe Cicely Tyson who had the worst experience among the cast.
Yeah, I don't think she was very happy to be there. And she, I said a minute ago, like sometimes when you're in these extreme situations, it can bring everybody together and sort of make the unit stronger. She wasn't part of that. I don't think she was happy at all to be there, and wasn't just, consequently wasn't the sunniest of people to be around. She also, I remember this vividly, she had to wear these horrible contacts in her eyes for her character, and to make them look like cat eyes. And they were really problematic and painful, and she also had to wear these like super long, like fake nails because of her character, like claws. And so she couldn't get these contacts out of her eyes. So she would have an assistant trying to pull these things out of her eyes. And it was just always like painful and awful and uncomfortable. And she would, she was never in a good mood.
The production of The Bluebird ended up going at least twice as long as anticipated. And that $2.4 million budget wound up being somewhere over $8 million. But about 8 months after filming began, and 10 months after George Cukor first arrived in Leningrad, production finally wrapped. A Christmas 1975 release was not going to happen. It would have to wait until April of 1976 to hit American theaters, but before that could happen, a premiere needed to take place. And while yes, most movie premieres take place in Hollywood, this was something different. The uniting of two countries for the first time in cinema, that gets to premiere at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C.
That was a big deal. Really, really interesting as far as film premieres go, because it was It was way more of a sort of like political, like a government spectacle than a film spectacle. There was speeches made by government people and not film people. It was bizarre. It was kind of weird.
They had this extraordinary Kennedy Center showing of the picture because the Iranian ambassador was in love with Elizabeth, I think. He was a big movie fan. And so they had this incredible affair at the Kennedy Center for the picture, and the whole diplomatic community was invited. And I went there with my wife at the time and my two little kids, and it was a great occasion in Washington. I remember that. But I remember sitting through the picture, quite embarrassed.
Yeah, that's right. He said quite embarrassed. The movie did not turn out as well as they had hoped.
We showed the picture in New York to the critics at the Carnegie. Remember the Carnegie Theater? And Rex Reed was there, and asked Rex Reed to come, and Rex Reed didn't know me. We're outside the Carnegie, and I just want to hear what people are talking about, and I'm sort of behind Rex Reed, and he said something like, "What a piece of," something like that, and I got so upset. I went to him. I said, "You, God damn it! My name is Paul Maslowski. I produced this picture, and that's a terrible thing to say. The work that went into George Cukor." I remember I got so upset I wanted to punch him out. But I was just defending all that effort that we all had, because it's not that bad a movie. It really isn't. It just sort of sits there.
I knew the story. I knew what they were trying to say. The bluebird of happiness. It's in your backyard, right? It's very sort of like almost like cliche kind of thing. You don't have to go looking for happiness. It's here in your backyard, right? That's the sort of like the bottom line, right? And so I knew all that. I knew what they were trying to say. But even as a kid, you I looked at that, and it's hard not to see the sort of, what's the right word? I don't want to talk terribly badly about it, but it doesn't really, the sets and everything, it all looks a little like not professional, not top notch. You know what I mean? You expect to see top notch from a top notch company with a top notch crew and stuff, but some of the sets look just like terrible, and the dubbing of the dialogue for the Russian actors didn't work right. It all kind of it's a little uncomfortable.
And those tepid responses they got at the premieres were pretty much the standard reaction the Bluebird would receive. Critics were not kind, and audiences stayed away.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is just me, or this is just working on enough things, and you get sort of this attitude of yeah, well, that one wasn't so great. I mean, it's just the way it is. I didn't have. Maybe this is my personality. I'm pretty low key, but maybe my expectations were okay, all right, well, moving on. We'll do something else. This one didn't turn out so great. We knew it was difficult all the way along, and this is what happens when it's that difficult.
Earlier I said that George Cukor on paper seemed like a great choice for a project like this. After all, he's one of the all-time greats, and his filmography speaks for itself. The Women, A Star is Born, Adam's Rib, Born Yesterday, and The Philadelphia Story are just a few of his triumphs. Seriously, go look at that filmography. It's stellar. But those were all in the 40s and 50s. And his last major success, My Fair Lady, was in 1964. That's 10 years prior to him getting on a plane to Leningrad. So there was a belief that hiring Cukor had been a mistake, that he had been too old to handle the rigors of shooting in the Soviet Union. After all, he was 75 at the time filming was done. Here's what Todd had to say about working with George Cukor.
It's hard for me to sometimes separate what I remember and what I know about him now, because what I know about him now is he's just one of Hollywood's greatest directors of all time. And so when I think back on that show and I'm a kid, I don't know that. People tell you that, oh, this is a big deal Hollywood director. And it's like, okay, whatever. I'm 10. I don't care about movies from the 40s, right? So he was very intense. He was definitely in charge. He was definitely a actor's director in that he didn't worry about the technical stuff too much. Like he didn't want to talk to Freddie Young too much about the shots. He just wanted to talk to the actors. He was very intense. And this is just like a visual example, and it's something that I just remember as a kid thinking. He always had the script in his hands, and it was always like rolled up, right? He was always clenched between his hands, like rolled up. And he would get down and lean down right in your face, and he'd be holding this script that was like rolled up real tight in his hands, and he'd be talking to you, very intense. He always put his finger up in your face, very intense. And I just remember thinking as a kid, you're never going to be able to open that script again. It's just like formed into a cylinder. It's never usable except for you just to hang on to it. I don't think he was entirely thrilled about, the fact that the two youngest members of the cast were the ones who were in every single scene. He loved the ladies, the stars. He loved Liz Taylor. He loved Ava Gardner. That's who he wanted to be working with. Not so much a couple little kids, but he was that kind of old Hollywood, very, very professional and a lot of decorum. You know what I mean? The manners were important.
Personally, I feel blaming Cukor for the failure of the Blue Bird is a bit unfair. Whoever was calling action on set would have still had to deal with interpreters, outdated equipment, and sick cast members. He had altruistic intentions going into it, and he really bought into the idea of a cinematic detente. Cukor always had nice things to say about his time filming the Blue Bird.
The Russians couldn't understand the snide things that were said about the production. I found them, from a human point of view, extremely kind and cooperative in every way. The picture started off rather awkwardly, but then it got its own tempo, its own momentum. We were pioneering, and it's bound to be easier for the next people who go over.
These days, the picture, which fed gossip columnist headlines and featured an all-star cast and was an international co-production with the Soviet Union, is barely remembered. If you want to watch it, you'll need a region-free DVD player because there's no current U.S. release for it, which does make sense considering people's reactions to the film.
I don't remember ever seeing the movie and it not going over without a sense of total confusion at the end. What is that we just watched? Everybody was certainly polite and enthusiastic with their applause, but I don't think anybody ever understood what happened on the screen when they see that movie.
I saw it not too long ago. I think it was last year. I ran it for my grandson. My grandson now is 17. He said, "I want to see the picture you made in the pictures you made in Russia." And I ran the Blue Bird for him, and he was not particularly impressed. But
I never got to see it. They never released it in the UK, so we never saw it. However, did manage to get hold of a DVD copy. It's not in Russian, the cover's in Russian, but I have actually seen it. It's nothing really like I thought it was going to be. The story was explained to me. I think I was thinking it was going to be more like a Disney film because I only saw certain parts when I was there. As I say, I only saw the two sets, Land of the Future and Land of Luxury. I didn't really see any of the other stuff. So, I never saw like the cottage or anything like that. So I couldn't really imagine it.
How old were you when you finally saw it?
Probably about 40.
But there is at least one person out there who has love for the Blue Bird.
My name is Yola Le Caïnec. I live in France, more precisely in Rennes, near the Mont Saint-Michel and Saint-Malo. I am born in 1971.
And as far as Yola was concerned, seeing the Blue Bird was not simply watching a movie and you end up liking it. it's a movie that deeply affects her.
It was an absolute revelation. I haven't read at that time the play of Maeterlinck, and I discovered with an emphatic enthusiasm all the magic world of the bluebird, thanks the wonderful heart of Cukor. I loved to see Cukor friends, Elizabeth Taylor and Ava Gardner, playing such amusing parts, light and pleasure. Jane Fonda was my favorite. When she appeared as Night, it was a surprise for me. I could never imagine she could play like that. A phantasm, furious and tender at the same time. The cat Tylott, embodied by the marvelous Cicely Tyson, is great too in this register. I felt very happy at the end of the movie. Like the sick young girl, I was no more sick. My happiness came from the fact that I understood I was not alone, believing in the souls of all the things around us. It is not mysticism or metaphysics. It is the understanding that the human being is not alone on the earth. Things take care of him, and he must, in return, take care of them. This movie belongs to what we can call the care cinema, a cinema for well-being and well-thinking.
And Yola has seen The Bluebird a lot. In fact, I think it's safe to say she's probably seen it more than anyone.
I saw it 100 times, probably more. I showed it to other people, young and not young people. Some of them don't like The Bluebird, but they stay my friends, of course, if they don't like it. But perhaps I can say one thing. I learned something about people from the way they talk about The Bluebird, a link they have with the unreality, the imaginary, and also the childhood. Indeed, when I showed The Bluebird to children, it was not the same reaction. My son saw it when he was very young, just some scenes, and after when he was 4, all the movie. He saw it today more than 10 times, I think.
Like any good mother, she's been able to pass on her love for The Bluebird to her son.
I loved this movie. When I was younger, it was for me a horror movie. Today, I am 11 years old and I see The Bluebird differently. For me, it's no more a story than a horror show.
He has a point there. Comparing The Bluebird to a horror show makes perfect sense to me. The movie does have that 70s creepy kids film thing going on, kind of like Willy Wonka in that way. I should also point out that while he has not seen the movie 100 times like his mother, he has seen it at least 10 times. So, if nothing else, Todd Lookinland and Paul Maslansky and the rest of the Bluebird cast and crew can take some solace in the fact that their work did deeply affect a couple of people out there.
This movie belongs to what we can call the care cinema, a cinema for well-being and well-thinking.
I should point out that we're only getting to hear from the Westerners on this podcast. I did attempt to get at least one person from the Russian side, but had no luck. I'm sure they would have their own unique outlook on the experience of having all these people from Hollywood show up in their part of the world. And while, yes, it's a forgotten movie, and it was a very difficult shoot for a lot of people, but Todd Lookinland and Paul Maslansky both have an incredibly positive outlook on their time on the Bluebird set.
I tell you, one of the great adventures in my life, the relationship between the cast and the Russian crew was just spectacular. It really was. Even though language was a difficulty, everyone did their best. They realized, most everybody realized that they were doing something that was quite unique, that was a first.
I just have to reiterate,
Yeah.
Liz Taylor was the best ever. Jane Fonda was fantastic. Ava Gardner was a dream. All these people who you could think, oh, that might be a diva personality to work with. Wrong. They were just the greatest. They were so great. And it's interesting to be a grown-up now, and if I see Liz Taylor on TV, like she was on Cat on Hot Tin Roof on TCM the other night, and I can look at that person and I go, I remember you as just being the nicest, best person, and that's worth the entire experience. That there. I tell you what, man, the experience of doing that, like going over that adventure, getting sort of like involved in the Russian culture and the Russian people, and just sort of like making our way for 8 months through living in the Soviet Union. That adventure was great. It was fantastic. And I look back on that with a sense of happiness and gratitude. That's a life adventure that is very unique and was very fun and very cool. The movie, not so great. The adventure was well worth it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Industry, presented by Movie Maker. For information about what's going on in movies or how to make them yourself, visit moviemaker.com. This episode was written, edited, and hosted by me, Dan Delgado. Special thanks to my guests who were all so great to speak with. Stephen Warner, Paul Maslansky, who let me ask him all kinds of questions about any movie that he had made, and of course, Todd Lookinland. Todd, by the way, moved behind the camera and has worked on a number of big hits you've probably seen, like The Nightmare Before Christmas. And if you are a huge Nightmare Before Christmas fan, then you should definitely check out Todd's own podcast. It's called The We Know Jack Show, where a different crew member from The Nightmare Before Christmas gets interviewed by Todd about their experiences making that iconic film. Check it out at weknowjackshow.com, or you can probably find it wherever you found this podcast. Also, thanks to Yola and her son. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce her last name, so I will not attempt to do it. And Bob Harkins played George Cukor. Bob, by the way, is another podcaster, host of the great documentary series Raised Sports, and he is the proprietor of the documentary podcast network Story Hanger. All the shows there are winners, and I say this because I have listened to all of them, so go check out Story Hanger. Did you enjoy this episode? If so, then please leave a nice 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you can. It really does make a difference in helping people find the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do that. Send an email to dan@moviemaker.com. You can also tweet at me at TheIndustry13. Follow on Instagram, that's industry_podcast. And on Facebook, it's at The Industry Pod. We have a new website up. It's pretty much the same address, industrypodcast.org, and you can leave a voicemail if you like. There is a blue microphone icon in the bottom right corner. If you click it, you can go ahead and feel free to share your thoughts with me. And if someone actually does this, I may use it in an episode, so you have been warned. You can now also buy me a coffee there as well. That's right, make a small donation to help keep me caffeinated enough to make another episode. And last, for those of you who are into this sort of thing, show notes to all of the sources that were used in this episode can be found on the website, industrypodcast.org. Go ahead and check the blog section for the Bluebird show notes. Thanks again for listening to this episode. My name is Dan Delgado, and I'll be back again soon with another seemingly forgotten story from the industry.